You know, folks, I've been around long enough to see just about everything in American politics. I've seen moments that made me proud, moments that made me worried, and moments that made me scratch my head and wonder if we're all watching the same country. But yesterday, July 1st, 2026, something happened in Medora, North Dakota, that I think deserves more attention than it's getting. The President of the United States stood up in front of 3,000 people and told them he just had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt. Now, before you react to that, let me tell you the full story is stranger than the headline. And what it reveals about where we are as a country is something every American ought to think about. Because this wasn't just a quirky moment at a ribbon cutting. This was a sitting president at the dedication of a presidential library, using the legacy of one of our greatest leaders to advance an agenda that Theodore Roosevelt himself would have fought against. And I read a sharp breakdown of exactly this contradiction in the Blue Bill before I even watched the speech. One of the few sources left that'll actually walk you through what happened without spinning it for one side or the other. And what happened yesterday matters. We'll get into all of it, but first let me set the stage. The Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library is a $450 million project, privately funded, built on 93 acres near the entrance to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It opens to the public on July 4th, the 250th birthday of this nation. Now that's a beautiful thing. I mean that sincerely. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the most remarkable human beings ever to hold the office I once held. He went to the North Dakota Badlands in 1884 as a 25-year-old man grieving. His wife and his mother died on the same day in the same house. Can you imagine that? And he went out west and the land healed him. He came back a different man. He became the youngest president in American history. He built the Panama Canal. He signed the Antiquities Act. He created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, protected 230 million acres of public land. He earned the title Conservation President. And he once said something I never forgot. He said, "The nation behaves well if it treats its natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value." Now, that is the man whose library opened yesterday. And when a sitting president shows up to honor that man, it should be a moment that unites us. A moment bigger than any one party. A moment to reflect on what public service actually means. And I want to give credit where it's due. Showing up, cutting the ribbon, bringing Roosevelt's Medal of Honor from the White House to the library. That's a generous gesture. That medal had been displayed in the Roosevelt Room at the White House, and presenting it to the library alongside the Medal of Honor earned by Roosevelt's son who fought on D-Day. That is a meaningful act of historical stewardship. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. When a president does something right, you say so. But here's the honest truth. And this is where things start to get complicated. The visit itself quickly became something else entirely. The president toured the library privately, and during that tour, he interacted with an artificial intelligence exhibit built by Microsoft and a company called Lemon Slice. The exhibit is called Talk with TR. You walk up, swipe a bracelet, press a button, and you have a conversation with an AI version of Theodore Roosevelt. It's built on his speeches, his letters, his books. And the president asked this AI hologram whether the Panama Canal was Roosevelt's greatest achievement. And now here's the part that made headlines. He then told the crowd from the stage at the Burning Hills Amphitheater, quote, "I even had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt." He said, I said, "What did you think about the Panama Canal? Do you consider that your greatest achievement? How do you feel about the fact that the Democrats gave the Panama Canal away to Panama for $1? Now half the internet thought the man was confused. He wasn't. He was talking about the AI exhibit, but the way he framed it tells you everything you need to know about how this visit was being used. He wasn't honoring Roosevelt. He was using Roosevelt, or at least a digital simulation of him, to make a partisan talking point about the Panama Canal and to take a shot at Democrats. And I have to say, as a Democrat and as a former president, that framing is misleading. President Carter signed the Panama Canal Treaties in 1977 after extensive bipartisan deliberation. The canal was transferred to Panama in 1999 during my administration in accordance with those treaties. It wasn't given away for $1. It was a negotiated act of sovereignty that the majority of the Senate ratified. Now, you can disagree with that policy. That's fair. But to stand in front of a crowd at a presidential library and reduce that entire diplomatic chapter to a partisan punchline using an AI that can't push back, that's not leadership. That's theater. And let me tell you something about the Medal of Honor moment, because this got less attention than it should have. After presenting Roosevelt's medal, the president looked at his two sons in the audience and said, and I'm paraphrasing loosely here, that he wanted to give one to himself and one to them. He said they'd have a threesome, his word. He talked about giving his sons the Medal of Honor for their genius at hunting and giving himself one for taking on Russia or something. Now look, I understand humor. I've told my share of jokes that didn't land exactly right, but the Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration this country gives. It is awarded for valor above and beyond the call of duty. Men and women have died earning it. Theodore Roosevelt's son earned his storming Utah beach on D-Day, and to stand at the dedication of that man's library and turn the medal into a family joke, even if it was meant to be lighthearted, it tells you something about how seriously the office and its symbols are being treated. When I was president, there were moments where you just didn't go there. Not because anyone would stop you, but because the weight of the office reminded you that some things are sacred. The Medal of Honor is one of them. Now here's what really ought to concern every American, regardless of party. The president stood in that amphitheater surrounded by Rough Rider reenactors and praised Theodore Roosevelt as a man of ambition and pride and greatness. But what he did not do, and this was conspicuous to anyone who knows the history, was mention Roosevelt's conservation legacy. Not once. He talked about the Panama Canal. He talked about tariffs in William McKinley. He talked about grit and ambition. But he did not mention that Theodore Roosevelt protected 230 million acres of American land. He did not mention the national parks. He did not mention the Antiquities Act. And the reason is obvious, because the current administration has systematically dismantled the very conservation framework Roosevelt built. They've removed protections from over 100 million acres of public land across both terms. They've weakened the Endangered Species Act. They've rolled back the Bureau of Land Management's conservation rule. In June of this year, they issued an executive order opening more than 300 million acres of Pacific Ocean national monuments to commercial fishing. Interior Secretary Burgum, who introduced the president yesterday and who served as North Dakota's governor, has been leading the charge to streamline oil, gas, and coal development on public lands. And conservation organizations, including the Center for Western Priorities and the Center for American Progress, have called a comparison between Trump and Roosevelt a clear farce. The Blue Bill actually ran a thorough piece connecting these policy rollbacks to the library opening, and it's the kind of reporting that lays the contradiction bare without needing to shout about it. Roosevelt ended the Gilded Age. What we're watching right now, in many ways, is the return of it. And I want to be fair. There are areas where Trump and Roosevelt share common ground. Both had strong views on executive power. Both were willing to challenge political establishments. Both had big personalities. And the Supreme Court ruling this week that expanded presidential authority to remove heads of independent agencies. The president celebrated that from the stage, and he connected it to Roosevelt. He said the power had been taken away from another Roosevelt, FDR, in 1932, and that they just want it back. Now there's a real policy debate to be had about the proper scope of executive power, but there's a difference between strengthening the presidency and weakening the institutions that check it. Roosevelt believed in a strong executive, but he also believed in the professionalization of the federal workforce. He believed in independent regulators. He believed that public servants should be insulated from political pressure, not subjected to it. What we saw this week was the court overturning 91 years of precedent that protected Senate-confirmed officials from being fired by the president at will. And if you combine that with the administration's approach to the civil service, Doe's mass firings, the hollowing out of agencies, you're not strengthening government, you're concentrating power. And as the Blue Bill reported, The institutional implications of that ruling extend far beyond any single presidency. But let me tell you what concerns me most, and it's something I think about a lot. When a president uses the opening of a presidential library, a moment that should be about reflection, about history, about the long arc of the republic, to denounce the Supreme Court on birthright citizenship, to call elected Democrats communist, to joke about giving himself the Medal of Honor, and to gloat about ripping 90 acres of protected federal land away from the Forest Service. His exact words were, "We ripped it away from the federal government. They don't know it's missing." What you're watching is the erosion of the line between ceremony and campaign rally. And that line matters. It matters because presidential libraries exist to hold our history in trust. They're not staging grounds. They're not backdrops for partisan speeches. When I go to a presidential library, any of them, I feel the weight of the office. I feel the responsibility, and I think about all the decisions I made that I'm proud of, and all the ones I do differently. That's what those places are for. And when you take that space and use it the way it was used yesterday, arriving on a Qatar-gifted Air Force One that both parties have raised ethics concerns about, riding a flag-draped train through the Badlands like a victory lap. You're not honoring the presidency, you're performing it. Now look, I don't want to end on a dark note because that's not who I am and it's not what I believe about this country. America has corrected course before. We corrected course after Watergate. We corrected course after Vietnam. We built coalitions across the aisle to balance budgets, to expand trade, to invest in people. And I believe we can do it again. But it requires something from us. All of us. It requires that we hold our leaders accountable, not just for what they say, but for what they leave out. That we don't let historical revisionism go unchallenged. That we remember what Theodore Roosevelt actually stood for. Not the version that's politically convenient, but the whole man, the conservationist, the trust buster, the man who said the rights of the public to the nation's resources outweigh private interests. Those aren't democratic values or Republican values. Those are American values. And on the 250th anniversary of this great nation, I think we owe it to ourselves and to every president who came before us to defend them. Not with anger, not with cynicism, but with the same quiet determination that sent a grieving 25-year-old from New York out to the Badlands of North Dakota, where the land made him whole and the country made him great. That's the story worth telling. And I hope when folks walk through that library this Saturday, that's the story they take home with them. God bless you and God bless the United States of America.